Welcome back to our live training session here. We're going to be taking a look in this final training module at doing the cold start and warm-up enrichment tuning process. Now, every engine is going to be a little bit different in terms of what it's going to want for the fueling, for cranking, for post-start or warm-up, but we can take a look at some specific information when we log and review the data log in order to determine what we need to change and what the engine's going to want. So we're going to take a look at what this engine's going to respond to, and we'll talk about the tables that are in play to make sure that the engine is going to crank, fire, and run when it's cold. We'll find things completely change with our fueling delivery for the engine when it's cold versus when the engine is warm, and we have good atomization out of the injector. So we have a wall wetting factor we have to discuss and some frictional drag on the engine when the engine is cold that we have to overcome. And it'll make a little bit more sense as we just walk through it here in the beginning of the training module. Now, we're also going to be taking a look at acceleration enrichment tuning, which is fairly simple with the fuel tech. So we'll talk about the parameters that are in play, do some testing, do some logging, and figure out what this engine's going to want for the acceleration enrichment. Now, with the individual throttle bodies, and because they're so large, we might have to go in and tweak and adjust some of the default settings that are already populated in this base file when we started off with that new file calibration from Fuel Tech when we began our base map creation process. So as I was doing the calibrating and tuning, the acceleration enrichment default values seemed to work okay, but we can definitely optimize them. And we do want to optimize them. We don't want it to be too lean on tip-in, which can leave us a hesitation as we're driving and unsmooth drivability. We also don't want to have it too rich and excessively pumping fuel into the engine, which will really take a hit to our economy and can wash out our cylinder wall. So we want to be careful with this. We want to make sure that we have something that makes sense in the programming for our engine. Now, let's discuss our situation here for the cold start. So I've let the vehicle here sit overnight. We're on a separate day of filming. It's bone cold. We can take a look down here. The coolant temperature showing here about 70 degrees. You see ambient temperature 65. They're fairly close. The calibration scale is pretty close for both of these. Usually there's going to be about a 2-3 degree difference between air temp, coolant temp. Again, there's about maybe about 4 degree difference right there. So it's still in the margin that it's acceptable, but we'll find the engine is cold. Now, when the engine is cold, we have two things going on here. First, we have a higher frictional drag on the engine. Higher frictional drag means that we have a torque loss for the output of the engine. And as a result, with less torque at the same airflow coming into the engine, we're going to find we idle lower. So we need to overcome that. In order to overcome the lower idle and the torque offset, we're using some spark timing to help us there. So let's go back in here to our ignition tables and talk about this real quick. We have an engine temp compensation table. I've had it 6 degrees here when the engine is cold in order to help offset some of that frictional loss and drag on the engine and bump up the torque a little bit. Now, on a warm engine, we want to make sure this table is zeroed out because this can add against the main spark timing table. We want that to just ride on the main spark timing table once we're for sure above 140 degrees or warmer in coolant temperature. But in the cold temperature right now, I definitely want to go and add a little bit more spark timing in there, and we can see we've done that right here. Now, in addition to this, if we're talking about the warm-up period or where the engine fires off cold, we also want to have additional fueling when the engine's firing off for the first few seconds, as well as when the engine's coming up to operating temperature, as well as in the cranking conditions. So when we're spraying the fuel out of the injector into the engine, we're going to have another factor to consider, and that's going to be a wall wetting effect. Now, the wall wetting effect is always in play, but what we'll find is on a cold engine, when the fuel sprays out of the injector, it doesn't atomize very well because there's no heat in the manifold and into the intake port. And as a result, we'll find a lot of fuel is going to stick in the intake port and in the intake valve and not make its way into that particular engine cycle that we're injecting the fuel into. As a result, we'll start to run lean. We need to compensate for that. We need to make sure we're adding additional fuel above and beyond what we would normally inject into the engine when the engine is warm. And this is known as fuel film modeling or tuning, but the way we're going to handle this in the fuel tech would be with the warm-up enrichment table. So it's going to be giving us a way that we can get around this fuel film modeling, or the way to deal with fuel film modeling as we would on a factor ECU. So if we take a look here, under our fuel tables, we have a couple things to help us offset the cranking fuel that we're going to need, a little bit higher cranking fuel. We're going to find that we have a post-start fuel that we need to add for the first few seconds for the engine to stabilize, and then that warm-up enrichment where we're going to have to add additional fueling in as the engine is coming up into operating temperature. So if we go down here, we can take first a look at our engine start, and technically we have our prime pulse. The prime pulse is used to add a huge shot of fuel for the first cranking revolution, then it dissipates. This is to prime up the combustion chamber so it starts a little bit easier. Then we have our engine start. We can see right here we're at approximately 68 degrees, and we're going to command 12 milliseconds of cranking fuel. Now this may be close, it may not. If we have a lot of cranks for the engine to fire off, that means that we need additional fueling. We need to raise our values here. Usually I move in percentage increases. If I'm going in and making changes, I don't just bump it up from 12 to, let's say, 20 milliseconds. I usually go in and add maybe 20 to 50% more fuel, which would be accomplished by going into M here and then typing in something like 1.5, and that would increase it up. We can see there by 50%. And if I'm increasing it here, I'm also going to increase it at the lower values too. They're going to need more fuel. So kind of a rule of thumb there. We're going to see if these values are good. If it can crank, fire, and run fairly quick, then we're not going to touch our fuel. It's at least in our cranking table, our engine start table here, because it's going to be good. Same's going to go with the prime pulse here. Usually the prime pulse, we can just leave the default values. It does make an effect on the starting and making it start quicker, but engine start has more of an impact that I found for getting engine to fire off. Now, once it actually cranks and it fires, it transitions into the post start. That's going to be found here in the post start enrichment. Now, the way this table is shaped, it goes at 0 seconds. That's when we exit the 400 RPM threshold. We can see that's going to be found here under engine setup. We see RPM for engine start. So below 400 RPM, as the engine's cranking over and we're getting our trigger signal from our trigger, it's going to say that is using the cranking fuel, the cranking spark, and then above this threshold, it transitions into the run mode where it starts off at the 0 time in the post start, and it starts to then count upwards. And we add the post start and we add the warm up enrichment to whatever normally comes from our main fuel table. So there's our percentage of adders against the main fuel table pulse width. So again, once we exceed 400 RPM, it's going to go here, start at 0 seconds, and it's going to start to count across. Now notice, there's a lot of fuel added for the first little bit, and then between 1 to 10 seconds, that's going to dissipate away here. We have that set at 0. The last column in the table, regardless of however your table is set up, we want to make sure that this last column is zeroed out for sure when the engine is warm. So 122 to 176, 100% make sure that this is zeroed out. This is going to ensure that you're not adding fuel all the time against your main fuel table here. If you have values in your post start, jumping back in here, if you have values in your post start, so the last, let's say 2 values here, you're firing off your engine, the engine comes up to operating temperature, and if you had 10% fuel added here, you would constantly be adding 10% fuel against your normal main fuel table, which will skew up dialing in and calibrating your table. That would be the same thing as going into the overall fuel trim.
Thanks for checking out our teaser clip. If you want to see the rest of this video and more than 500 hours of current EFI training we have to offer, make sure you click right here. If you want to go and check out more teaser clips from this training course, click here, and you don't want to miss any of the videos we're going to be releasing on this channel, so make sure you subscribe and click here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.